By the mid-3rd century of the Common Era, civilizations across Afro-Eurasia were in trouble. All of the imperial states that had been linked together by the Silk Roads faced serious internal and external problems. That this happened near simultaneously across a vast swathe of Afro-Eurasia obviously invites a big history analysis. What was going on that explains this near universal contraction? Yet, although the reasons for this contraction were rather similar, the outcome varied enormously. In most regions of Eurasia, following a period of fragmentation, huge areas were eventually reunified under new agrarian civilizations. But in other places, notably in Western Europe, effective reunification never occurred. Human communities in Europe became components in small state-like structures that would eventually evolve into modern nations. Our dual task in this lecture is to trace the contraction of Afro-Eurasian civilizations and also consider the different outcomes of this process, differences that have had a tremendous influence on subsequent world history. Let's begin at the eastern end of Eurasia and work our way back towards the west. In China, during the later Han Dynasty, internal problems stemming from infighting between various elite groups resulted in a series of peasant revolts that, coinciding with an increase in the power of militarized nomads and regional warlords, led to the complete collapse of the Han in 220 CE. A comparison between the situation in China after the fall of the Han and that in Europe after the so-called decline and fall of the Roman Empire reveals that both regions were forced to deal with incursions by powerful militarized nomadic confederations at more or less the same time. With the collapse of central government, both the western and eastern regions of Afro-Eurasia experienced centuries of fragmentation, captured by the term Dark Ages, although this is a label that historians seldom use today. But there is a huge difference in outcomes here. While Western Europe was never effectively reunified after the fragmentation of the Western Roman Empire, in spite of several relatively short-lived attempts in early and modern times, China was successfully reunified under strong central government, a situation that continued with only one serious interruption through to the 20th century. The 3.5 centuries of disorder that followed the collapse of the Han are characterized by the rise and fall of regional states. To give you some idea of how chaotic this was, at one stage there were 16 different dynasties simultaneously competing for control of parts of China. And between the 3rd and 7th centuries, some 37 different dynasties attempted to rule. Of course, as we have repeatedly seen, periods of political fragmentation are generally fertile breeding grounds for technological and cultural evolution. And this was particularly true in southern China, where, for example, paper replaced older writing materials, so the books were more numerous than ever before. We know of one mid-6th century library that contained 140,000 texts. Agriculture also surged in the south, as did international maritime trade out of port cities. By the early 500s, the city of Nanjing, with a population of 1.5 million, was the largest city in the world. It was also during this age of disunity that Buddhism found its readiest acceptance in East Asia, as evidenced by the carving of spectacular Buddhist statue complexes at Yungang and Longmen. Buddhism traveled from China to Korea during the 4th century, arriving just when 3 separate kingdoms, Goguryeo, Paikche, and Silla, were embarking upon a long contest for control of the peninsula. Eventually, the kingdom of Silla formed an alliance with the Tang dynasty in China to defeat the other kingdoms, giving Silla control of much of the peninsula. Each of these 3 kingdoms contributed to what eventually became Korean culture, which remained distinct from China despite close trade and cultural relations, and the fact that for many centuries Korea was essentially a tributary state of the Chinese. Chinese influence was also strong in the nearby archipelago of Japan. The first written account of events there is found in a 3rd century Chinese history, which describes a loose coalition of 30 small communities presided over by a shaman queen called Himiko. Her reign corresponds with the beginning of a period marked by the erection of large earthen burial mounds with a distinctive keyhole shape. These mounds are evidence of the emergence of Elytz and larger political structures, although a truly centralized state did not appear in Japan until the 6th century. During the 7th century, Japanese rulers adopted Chinese-style imperial titles and began to build a powerful state using Chinese administrative techniques, a process that culminated with the construction of the grand new Japanese capital city of Nara. In China, it was the short-lived but effective Sui dynasty that ended the Age of Disunity late in the 6th century, paving the way for the success of the Tang dynasty that followed. The Sui were responsible for re-engaging China with the wider Eurasian world through commercial and military expeditions, and also for extensive infrastructure improvements, particularly the construction of the Grand Canal, which helped unify the divided Chinese realm. This was the largest hydrological project attempted to this point in history. Emperor Yangdi connected a series of canals into a network of artificial waterways that eventually stretched for over 1,100 miles and linked China's two great river systems, the Yellow River or Huanghe and the Yangtze. The canal thereby effectively linked China's north with its south, making possible a unified national economy for the first time. But construction on this scale made harsh demands on the peasants through high taxes and forced labor, and a military revolt capped by the assassination of the emperor brought the Sui dynasty to a rapid demise. Their successors, the Tang dynasty, which ruled for almost 3 centuries until 907 of the Common Era, returned China to strength and prosperity, creating what was undoubtedly the wealthiest and most powerful civilization on the planet. The second Tang emperor, Taizong, continued the work of the Sui in improving China's transportation and communications infrastructure. Good roads, government-owned inns and postal stations, and an effective courier system united China as never before. The Tang also worked to ensure a steady supply of educated and ethical government officials by reintroducing the rigorous Confucian examination system, which worked so well that it was maintained by almost all subsequent dynasties until the collapse of the Qing dynasty in the 20th century. Under the Tang, China became a great imperial power. Chinese forces conquered Manchuria, Vietnam, much of Tibet, and large regions of Central Asia. In stark contrast to most traditional agrarian civilizations, the Tang government supported agricultural innovation, including the adoption of fast-growing rice, the iron plough, fertilizers, powerful draft animals, and sophisticated irrigation. Farming productivity soared, and China's population approached 100 million, leading to rapid growth in the number and size of cities. By the 10th century, Tang China was the most urbanized society ever seen. The capital, Chang'an, home to 2 million residents, was the largest city on the planet, while Hangzhou housed 1 million. By the 10th century, China was the world's most developed country and was home to 1/3 of the planet's total population. Innovation flourished in the workshops of these great cities, particularly the production of porcelain, high-quality iron and steel, silk, gunpowder, and printing. And trade on the Silk Roads revived as foreign merchants established a substantial presence in many Chinese cities. As a result, virtually every religion of Afro-Eurasia was practiced somewhere in the country. The sophisticated Confucian bureaucratic administrative model adopted by the Tang was perhaps the most stable form of government seen in the world to this point. And following the Tang, there were far fewer changes of dynasty. In fact, just 4 dynasties would rule China for the next 1,000 years. The vast, cosmopolitan, flourishing civilization of the Tang utterly dominated the eastern half of the Afro-Eurasian world zone, and their eventual collapse, a product of complacent rule by the later emperors, brought to an end an extraordinary chapter in the history of civilization. The end of the first millennium also represents a watershed in East Asian history more generally. In Southeast Asia, countries like Vietnam shrugged off centuries of Chinese control and began to forge their own distinctive cultures. The Goryeo dynasty in Korea replaced the Silla and went on to rule for the next 500 years. And in Japan, Chinese-style imperial institutions became increasingly irrelevant as centralized imperial power disappeared and a new and uniquely Japanese class of regional warriors, the samurai, began to assert themselves. Despite the collapse of the Han Dynasty then, by the end of the first millennium, all the features of what we would term East Asian culture today were well and truly in place. In South Asia, meanwhile, a century after the demise of the Kushan Empire, imperial rule and unification returned to India with the establishment of the Gupta Empire. Using marriage and diplomacy to forge links between regional states, Chandragupta created a dynamic kingdom in the Ganges Valley that was expanded by his able successors until it approached the territorial size of the Mauryan Empire. Gupta kings adopted imperial titles like Supreme Lord and Great King of Kings, but rather than establish centralized imperial administration over their realm, they preferred to rule instead through a network of regional rulers. The superb gold coinage of the Guptas is evidence of their prosperity, and they used much of this wealth to support Hinduism. But Buddhism also flourished during the Gupta period, notably at the great monastery and university at Nalanda, which attracted scholars and pilgrims from all over the Buddhist world. Particularly impressive are the scientific and mathematical achievements of Gupta intellectuals, like the great mathematician and astronomer Aryabhata, who proved that the Earth must be rotating on its axis and offered one of the most accurate numbers for the length of a year known from the pre-modern world, 365.2586805 days exactly. The earliest datable reference in Afro-Eurasia to the number 0 comes from the work of 6th century Indian scholar Va Hamihera. The concept, essentially a number to signify nothing, made complex equations much easier to calculate, and it was later adopted by Muslim merchants who spread it and the other numerals in the Indian mathematical system to the west. It is for this reason that the flexible numbering system used throughout the world today, the system of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., came to be named after the Arabs as Arabic numerals rather than after the Indians who actually first devised it. The Indian Golden Age declined during the 5th century in the face of a new wave of militarized nomads from Central Asia, particularly the aggressive White Huns who established their own kingdom in northern India. A brief attempt at South Asian reunification was made by Prince Harsha early in the 7th century, who brought a large area of the Ganges Valley under his control. We have an excellent account of Harsha's reign written by Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang, who traveled extensively through Central and South Asia and stayed many years at Harsha's court. Xuanzang noted that Harsha was a devout patron of Buddhism and that the king donated the revenues of 200 villages for the upkeep of the Buddhist center at Nalanda. But local rulers had amassed too much regional power to accede to a single central authority, and following Harsha's death at the hands of an assassin, India reverted to a fragmented realm divided amongst regional polities, a situation that persisted until the arrival of Islam in the 9th century, which ushered in a new stage of commercial vitality, but also of political and religious tension. North of the Himalayas in Central Asia, the Parthian and Kushan empires were replaced in the early 3rd century by the Sasanians, who went on to create their own significant empire that would last for more than 400 years to 651 CE. At its peak, the Sasanian Empire stretched from Afghanistan to the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates, which brought them very much to the attention of the Romans. The founder of the Sasanian state, Ardashir, was a brilliant military leader who used the religion of Zoroastrianism to unify his empire. Ardashir and Roman Emperor Alexander Severus fought one another for the control of Mesopotamia, and the Euphrates became a fortified border between the two empires. The second Sasanian ruler, Shapur I, triumphed over 3 successive Roman emperors, defeating one, killing the next, and capturing the third. The Silk Roads remained a major land trade route during the Sasanian era, although maritime routes became even more important. Incessant wars between the Sasanians and the Romans disrupted land-based trade and brought the Arabs in southern Arabia into prominence as traders operating alternative routes from the Arabian Sea to the Mediterranean. The Sasanians attempted to keep monopoly control of key Chinese trade goods, especially silk. At one stage, Sasanian merchants famously bought all the silk on the Indian Ocean in order to control the price of this highly valuable commodity. Eventually, Arabia also came under Sasanian hegemony, which allowed the Sasanians to control the trade across the Arabian Sea. In the 6th century, meanwhile, a new group of migrating nomads appeared on the scene, namely the Turks, who who caused serious problems for the Sasanians and indeed for most of the agrarian civilizations of Eurasia. The Turks expanded out of their Mongolian homelands, disrupting the Tang Chinese and forcing the Hephthalites to move westwards, the migration that led eventually to the destruction of the Gupta Empire in India. The Chinese and the Sasanians used defensive walls to try and stop these Turkic incursions, but to little avail, and the Turks went on to have a decisive impact. The Turks eventually became a major trading partner of the Sasanians and the Byzantines, but this was not the end of Turkic political ambitions. And as they continued to slowly move westwards, they impacted every state they came in contact with through to the early modern era, reminding us again of the continuing impact of migration on human history. The 6th century reign of Khusro I was the high watermark for the Sasanians. He undertook major reforms throughout the empire, revitalizing Sasanian coinage, administration, taxation, and the military. Zoroastrianism also achieved its final form during the reign of Khusro. The sacred hymns of the Avesta, which contains the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster, were written down, and Zoroastrian fire temples were built throughout the empire. In the Sasanian capital city of Ctesiphon, the Arch of Khusro, the tallest standing building in Southwest Asia, was constructed as a symbol of the power of the King of Kings. Another extraordinary construction of Khusro's was the Wall of Gorgon. Other than the Great Wall of China, it was the longest continuous wall in antiquity, 120 miles long with 36 garrisoned barracks. The Sasanians maintained commercial relationships with the Tang Chinese and with the Byzantines. These three powerful new agrarian civilizations, ruling from their great cities of Chang'an, Ctesiphon, and Constantinople, came to control much of Eurasia from the Yellow River to the Mediterranean Sea. In the mid-7th century, however, this Eurasian system was upturned by the appearance of yet another new major power, the Muslims, who destroyed the Sasanians and ushered in a new era in the history of Afro-Eurasia. Although the Sasanians were absorbed into the expanding world of Islam, the Persian legacy continued to influence the region through the Muslim adoption of Persian models of government and administration. This reminds us that for more than 1,000 years, it was Persian peoples who created some of the most formidable imperial structures of all in the form of the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sasanian empires. But the ultimate significance of the Sasanians, like each of the Persian empires, is their role as facilitators of cultural exchange. In the same way that the Achaemenids had functioned as a bridge between Europe and Central Asia, through their encouragement of trans-Eurasian trade and exchange, the Sasanians acted as a geographic bridge between China and the West, and a temporal bridge between the ancient civilizations and new Islamic empire that was now destined to control these vast desert lands. Okay, let's head further west to Europe now, in this big history overview of the end of old Afro-Eurasian civilizations and the appearance of new ones during the first millennium of the Common Era. During the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire fragmented into a series of fortified estates and competitive regional kingdoms, but the eastern half remained unified and strong as the Byzantine Empire, which was destined to last for another 1,000 years. The early Byzantine Emperor Justinian, who reigned from 527 to 565 CE, was responsible for much of Byzantium's success. He and his wife Theodora crushed an internal revolt, strengthened the defenses of Constantinople, published a complete codex of Roman law, and even attempted to reconquer parts of the Western Empire, although ultimately without success. In the 7th and 8th centuries, Constantinople was able to withstand concerted sieges by the expanding forces of Islam, although large regions of the empire were lost to the Muslims. The core region survived, however, and used its strategic position to remain unconquered and wealthy through trade and innovative manufacturing until the middle of the 2nd millennium. Constantinople was eventually sacked by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. But because of Byzantine longevity, some historians argue that the civilization established by the Romans in the mid-1st millennium BCE successfully maintained its domination of large regions of Western Afro-Eurasia for about 2,000 years, suggesting that any notion of a Roman decline and fall in the early 5th century CE is simplistic and incorrect. The city of Constantinople, founded in 330 at the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium by the Roman Emperor Constantine I, increased in power and opulence under his successors until it rivaled Rome itself and surpassed all other cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. The city's status was further enhanced by the decision of the Orthodox Ecumenical Council of Constantinople to make that city's bishop the Patriarch, second in precedence only to the Pope in Rome. Justinian's spectacular rebuilding of the city's defences and of the great church of Hagia Sophia further enhanced Constantinople's status as the greatest city of Western Afro-Eurasia. The city lost some of its splendour in the 7th and 8th centuries following a series of natural disasters and desperate sieges. But in the 9th century, a military and economic recovery took place, leading to the great cultural achievements of the Middle Byzantine period, and the city's reputation as a place protected by military and commercial strength and by God. Further west, the western states of the former Roman Empire gradually lost the ability to tax their subjects or maintain a professional army in the centuries following the sack of Rome by the Visigoths. This led to political fragmentation and a new balance of power between monarchs, wealthy landholders, and the Christian church, which now began to play a significant role in the politics and culture of Western Europe. Indeed, Christian bishops often provided community leadership within an ecclesiastical framework that in some ways was a continuation of the earlier Roman imperial administrative system. However, the collapse of the Roman taxation and administration system made it difficult to maintain many of the Roman cities of the West. Some disappeared completely, while others broke up into areas of smaller settlements separated by ruins and spaces converted into market gardens and vineyards. Monumental architecture was now largely focused upon churches, which were often constructed out of materials recovered from abandoned ancient buildings. The relationship between the church in Rome and the church in Constantinople was strained from the beginning. The church in Rome pursued a political alliance with the Franks, and Pope Leo III's coronation of the Frankish king Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome on Christmas Day 800 was intended to undermine Byzantine claims to political and religious leadership. The Franks were the first in a series of Germanic-speaking dynasties to establish successful states in Western Europe. Under King Clovis, who reigned from 481 to 511 and converted to Christianity, rival Frankish subgroups were consolidated under a strong monarchy that took control of much of Gaul as far as the Rhine. Renewed Frankish expansion commenced late in the 7th century under a new family of Carolingian leaders, including Pepin II and his son Charles Martel, who would halt the Muslim invasion of Europe at Poitiers in 732 CE. The Frankish kingdom reached its height under Charlemagne, whose imperial state included all of modern France, parts of northern Spain, the territory between the Rhine and the Elbe rivers, northern Italy, and much of the middle Danube region. Yet Charlemagne's empire was fleeting, and by the late 9th century, power had reverted to a series of local princes who preferred to live in rural palaces in the heartlands of their kingdom, where their own lands and followers were concentrated. The Frankish lands were not entirely isolated, however. They were connected by commerce to the North Sea region, where prosperous trading centres started to appear. Other remnants of the old Western Roman Empire found their own ways to survive and eventually to interact with one another, albeit sometimes violently. In Italy, the Germanic Lombards lived in cities like Milan and Venice, which by the 9th century had already developed into a major commercial port. Rome remained the largest city in the West, with a population of perhaps 25,000 in the 8th century. In Spain, the destruction of the Visigoth kingdoms by the Muslims in 711 precipitated a wholesale economic collapse, although by the end of the 8th century, the unification of the territory that became known as Al-Andalus under the Arab Umayyad Emirate led to a gradual recovery. In Britain, many centuries of Roman occupation had increased the prosperity of a small class of villa owners. But by the mid-5th century, the breakdown of Roman control exposed these Romano-British to regular raids by Picts and Scots and by Anglo-Saxons from the mainland. A counter-offensive led by a mysterious ruler that some historians think was the prototype for King Arthur stabilized the situation, preserving the status of the post-Roman elite. By the early 7th century, 10 or more small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been established in England. Further north, trading and raiding in the later 8th and early 9th centuries brought Scandinavian peoples into close contact with communities in both Western Europe and Russia. The establishment of wealthy trading centres along the English Channel and North Sea coasts encouraged Scandinavians to develop ocean-going technology and link the Northern European exchange network into the Baltic region. But political instability in Denmark led to expeditions by armed bands of Vikings out of Scandinavia in the mid-9th century and to their raiding and eventual settlement in Britain, France, and Russia. Wealthy monasteries were particularly subject to Viking attacks, both on the coasts and in the interior, as the raiders used rivers to move inland. Using the Seine River in France in this manner, Vikings looted Paris in 845, and in the decades that followed, conquered several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain. In 878, King Alfred of Wessex defeated Viking forces at the Battle of Edington, after which the Danish king Guthrum accepted baptism, and the Scandinavian presence in England was officially recognized as the Danelaw. In France, land around the city of Rouen was granted in the year 911 to a Viking leader named Rollo, land that eventually evolved into the Duchy of Normandy. Scandinavian peoples also played a critical role in the emergence of the first Russian state. Vikings established commercial bases in Ukraine and Russia and took control of regional exchange networks, establishing themselves as a new elite that would evolve into rulers of the first real Russian state, Kievan Rus. The development of Russia was tied to the emergence of another group destined to play an important role in the future history of both Europe and Russia, the Slavs, who eventually occupied a wide region stretching from the Balkans to Russia, setting up a contest for their conversion between the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople. The year 1000 CE marks something of a watershed in the big history of civilization. Before 1000 CE, many of the world's societies were relatively isolated and diverse in their lifeways, their ideologies, and languages. Of course, there also existed large empires that joined together vast regions of Afro-Eurasia by trade and exchange, but outside of these, it was the local community that mattered most, maintaining a wide diversity of languages and beliefs. But after 1000 CE, the balance tipped and processes of convergence became more and more important. Contacts between once isolated regions multiplied, and migration, travel, and trade increased, creating new links between different communities and regions and much larger networks of exchange. It was the multiplication of these links during the second millennium that established the framework for today's globalized world. Although let's not forget that these frameworks were still only functioning within the world zones, not between them. Despite the re-emergence of huge agrarian civilizations, most of the surface of Earth was still occupied by foragers or pastoralists or subsistence farmers, and there was virtually no contact whatsoever between the world zones. Let's conclude by returning to the question with which we opened this lecture, the profound consequences of the different outcomes that followed the collapse of the agrarian civilizations of the ancient world. As we have seen in East Asia, huge traditional imperial structures such as that of the Tang dynasty were re-established, which became immensely powerful and wealthy. But in Western Europe, the collapse of Roman administration created a region of divided medium-sized city-states similar to the very first city-states that had appeared in Samaria thousands of years earlier. In the centuries that followed, these small states would resist all attempts to recombine and instead would go on to create their own individual city, regional, and eventually national destinies that would drive the world across the next threshold of complexity and into the modern age.